Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Liz Johns, and I am the Teaching and Learning Librarian at the Goucher College Library. At the library, we've asked faculty and staff to make print and media recommendations to the library to support our community in learning and practicing anti-racism. And we asked them to tell us what work spoke to them, what they thought would be supportive for our community. And there's so much great information out there that it can be difficult knowing where to start. And so over the next few weeks, we're hosting faculty and staff on Instagram Live, and also we'll be sharing some pre-recorded discussions about their recommendations. And joining me today is Dr. William Harder, the new Director of Faculty Professional Development and Teaching Excellence.
It's a mouthful.
Which is really exciting. Yeah, it was a mouthful. I had to read it off my paper, and I still messed it up. But you are here today to discuss some information on works that have been important to you and your teaching and in your work. So thank you so much for joining me today. We're excited that you joined us at Goucher. I think this is your second week here.
This is my third week, so I've been here a while now.
You're here. You're in.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're so glad that you're here and that you're going to be kicking off our anti-racism resources discussion. And I know there are a number of materials that you wanted to discuss today. So I think first let's start off with some poetry, which I was kind of surprised that but really excited that you recommended. And I believe you wanted to discuss the poetry of Morgan Parker. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Could you share a little bit about that poet and their work?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about her work today because in looking at other sort of, there's a lot of anti-racist reading lists going around and things like that. And in picking what I wanted to talk about today, I was looking at what I didn't see on other lists. Obviously, there are a lot of books like Ethan Kennedy's work, the classics of James Baldwin and people like, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, that are on a lot of those lists, and those foundational things. But I thought one thing I could do is try and see, what was missing from some of those lists, both in authors, but also in, what types of books weren't there. And by and large, poetry was something I didn't see, with the exception of, a couple lists seeing, like Claudia Rankine and some other more recent poetry. And I'm going to say this with the caveat, right, that I'm not a poet. I'm not at Goucher as a faculty member of poetry, right? I run our teaching center here. At my PhD is in political science, but I'm just, somebody that reads poetry in their own time and have, often looked to poetry as a way to sort of make meaning of the world around me in some situations. And so I wanted to talk about Morgan Parker a little bit, who's probably my favorite poet writing right now. And so, there's just something about her and her voice on blackness and on Black womanhood specifically, and what comes with that in terms of discussions of both obviously in the moments that we're in of the grief and the anguish and the anger with that, but also sort of the joy inherent in Black womanhood, also power, and just the full sort of experience here. And she just has a really unique voice that's always been really meaningful to me. So her most recent collection came out last year, and it's this collection, Magical Negro. But really, I wanted to talk about, just anything by her. She's got 3 really excellent collections out right now. There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce, and also Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night. And so, on a personal level, one of the reasons that I go to her work a lot is that, lately in the experiencing of these murders, of Black men and women, I find it's her words in my head that come to me, and so it's her that I keep coming back to. And there's a poem in this most recent collection called "A Brief History of the Present," which has been around for a little while in literary journals and earlier versions of it. And, it was written in response to the death of Michael Brown. But I have this very vivid memory of being in my car and on Twitter watching the video of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And it's the end of this poem that keeps coming back to me. And frankly, I've come back to it too many times. But I just thought, if you wouldn't mind, I'd read sort of the end of that piece.
I was going to ask you if you could read some of it to us. Yeah.
So this is sort of the end of this poem, A Brief History of the Present. And so Parker writes, I worry sometimes I'll only be allowed a death story. No one will say in the New Yorker how my mother made her money, who I married, how my career began. Your people. The death story is just a name folded into another name. My name might be a list, or him, or a body, an investigation, a year, a lineage. I might become an autopsy, and the reason won't matter. Only my understanding, my swallowing of my rightful place, tectonic plates clicking like a jaw, and stubbornly, like history, my mouth becoming their mouth, speaking who I am. And in this moment, that idea, sorry, that's the conclusion. I went right into why this matters to me. But just that idea of only being allowed a death story is just a really powerful thing to me that, I just keep coming back to is a reminder to think of not just how we're introduced to these victims of police violence and other violence stemming from white supremacy, but to remember the history of the humanity before we learn their names. And so that poem has just meant a lot to me over the years, and I know the barriers to entry to poetry are sometimes difficult, and people don't know what to do with it sometimes. But just as somebody that's taken a lot of meaning from that, I wanted to make sure to always, preach the gospel of Morgan Parker wherever I can. So, so that's my thoughts on Morgan Parker.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for sharing that and for reading it. That the poem you just read, when was that written?
So this, you would find it in her most recent volume that just came out in 2019. Okay. But okay. I've seen it, it's written in response to Michael Brown. And so I think I've seen it, I probably first came across it in 2016 or so, in some literary journals and online, in some earlier versions of it. Yeah. Yeah,
I think that was really powerful writing, and barriers to poetry. I'm not one to engage in poetry very much. I remember the poetry that I read as a kid was like Shel Silverstein, and that's basically the extent of my engagement with poetry. But when you mentioned this, when you recommended it, I started looking into it, and I was surprised how many books and works of Morgan Parker that we have. I'm not sure if we have that most recent one, but we do have. You held it up. The other one was blue.
There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce is the one.
No, not that one. The other one.
Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night.
Yes, I think I recognize that one. Yeah, we do have that one at the library. And I've been really, I was really intrigued that you recommended these things, and I think some of them we actually have as ebooks too.
Oh, great.
So for someone like me who isn't used to reading poetry, who doesn't really engage with it very much, how would you recommend that someone start with this kind of work? Do you recommend flipping through it and finding one or two things to start with, or do you recommend starting at the beginning and going through the end like a regular book? How does somebody engage with poetry, particularly poetry like this at this time?
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that people get worried sometimes that there is a right and a wrong way to engage with poetry, and there's certain certainly a critical theory way to read and digest this, but I don't know that there is a right and a wrong way to engage it when you're doing it for yourself. And so you can go in and find the ones that speak to you, but you can also, I mean, they're collected as a volume for a reason, and it can be read front to back as a collection. I think one thing that I do when I read poetry is I make rules about pacing myself, right? That I have a poetry book that I'll often work through, and I'll say, okay, well, I'm never going to do more than 2 in a sitting the first time through, or more than 1 in a sitting the first time through, so I can sit with them for a little while. And I like that just as a practice of saying, you know, well, yes, this is only a 60-page book, but I'm gonna take a month to read it, and I'm gonna go and I'm gonna come back to it, and I'm going to look at, you know, the pacing and the line breaks, and I'm going to read it out loud so I can hear the lyricism that I might miss if I'm reading it only internally to myself. And so I think, you know, sometimes poetry is scary to read because we think that, you know, we have to get why it's working, but you can also just don't get too caught up in the big part of it. Find the moments that work for you, right? Find the phrases and the turns of phrase and the little moments that matter. Because sometimes it's in just the images and the small parts, you know, just that idea of only getting a death story. There's a lot more to that poem, right? But find the moments that matter to you.
Right, absolutely. That's good advice. Thank you. I will keep that in mind as I try to dive in myself. So is there anything, you've spoken a lot about why this is important to you and what you've kept returning back to over the past couple weeks, months. What do you think that members of the Gaucho community could learn or get out of this material at this particular moment?
Yeah. So there's a couple parts on this. One, obviously, the processing of you know, the immediate moments, and as we think through the experience of grief and anger and despair in these times, a poem like that is going to have, you know, language that may help us process our own understandings of it. The other thing that I like a lot about Morgan Parker, because one of the reasons I wanted to talk not just about this most recent collection, but the entirety of her work, is I think when you read her on Blackness, she does a good job of helping you contextualize that this is not just the current moment that we're in, right? And this is not just the current presidential administration that we're in, but this is a much larger system of racist policies, racist structures, racist institutions that have been going on and impacting long before this administration and this current moment in time. This is a symptom, you know, the current moment and the current administration is a symptom of this, not the cause of these moments. And so let me just read one other short thing out of this There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce collection. She's got a poem in here that's pretty short, but it's maybe one of her better known poems. This was originally in the New York Times, and it's called "The President Has Never Said the Word Black." And for context, right, the president in this poem is Barack Obama. And so that this is a reminder, I think, when we think about the impacts of these systems and these institutionalized forms on this, right? And we think back to, you know, not only the most powerful Black man that has existed in this country at the prime of his power when he is in the U.S. presidency, and we can think about the ways that these systems impact his behavior there. So let me read this. The president has never said the word black. To the extent that one begins to wonder if he is broken, it's not so difficult to open teeth and brass taxes. The president is all like, filed on the bleep hand side. The president be like, we lost a young boy today. The pursuit of happiness is guaranteed for all fellow Americans. He's nobody special like us. He says, brothers and sisters, what kind of bodies are movable and feasts? What color are visions? When he opens his mouth, a chameleon is inside, starving. And so that's the poem the president has never said the word black. And I think it's a useful reminder sometimes that we can look across our catalog and we can look at how these institutions can exert powers in subtle ways and in not so subtle ways, right? As we think about the work of anti-racism, as we think about the work of dismantling these institutions, obviously we think in the major ways when we talk about police reform, when we talk about the violence that is exerted on these populations, but I think we also have to think about the more subtler ways that these things are impacted, particularly in the way we talk and the way we interact in our everyday lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting when you first said that I didn't think you were going to talk about, that the poem was going to be about President Obama. So yeah, I think we definitely have a lot that we can learn and get out of this poetry that you're recommending. So I think this is a really valuable contribution. Because like you said, there are tons of lists going around, and when I did a call to the Goucher College staff and faculty, they started sending me lists, and I was like, no, I've seen the list. I want to hear from you. I want to know what's impacting you and our community. And so I think that this was nice that you've seen all these lists too. You've taken a look and you tried to identify some gaps. So I think this was really helpful. So thank you very much for sharing that about the poetry.
Happy to. Yeah.
And for highlighting Morgan Parker. Is there anything else that you think we should know about this type of work before we shift gears a little bit into the next material?
I'll say Google her and see her read, because poetry exists on a page, but it also exists in performance, and just to watch her read and embody these poems is really excellent. Once we get back to doing things and going places in physical space, if you ever have the opportunity to see her read, do so. A couple years ago, I had the opportunity to see her read down in DC with probably one of the best double billings ever. It was her and Roxane Gay, and that was that was incredible. So if you ever get a chance to see her live and go to a reading, or there's plenty on YouTube to go find her, because her voice is powerful on the page, and it's even more powerful, I think, when you can hear it.
Wow. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. There was another piece that you wanted to discuss called "The Privileged Poor" by Anthony Abraham Jack. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to talk about poetry, I'm also, my job here at Goucher is to run our teaching center, and so I wanted to make sure that I also brought some things to the table about higher ed and about colleges and universities. So this is a book that came out last year that has it's gotten some good attention around it. And so the full title is "The Privileged Poor: How Elite Colleges Are Failing Disadvantaged Students." And so a little background on the book. A book is good when you can sort of boil it down, the argument, to one sentence. And at the core of this, there's one sort of simple argument, and that it's that access is not the same thing as inclusion. And this is obviously in the context of colleges and universities, and we're talking about students here. And so, we can put that another way and think just because someone makes it through the front door, right, doesn't mean they're included in what happens inside the house. Doesn't mean that they're welcomed into this process. Doesn't mean that they belong. And it seems like a really simple and straightforward and obviously idea, but I think it's an idea that we need to sometimes spend a little more time with and revisit repeatedly, because this is in the context of education and student belonging in these institutions. But I think that, we can think about this in any institution or from any perspective, right? We can tell these same stories about what belonging means to our faculty and our staff of color. We can talk about institutions other than universities, any workplaces, any social institutions and groups. We can think about what this means, right? And so this is particularly important in my mind when we talk about colleges and universities, because this is a story about belonging. Right? And one of the things that we know from a lot of higher ed research and a lot of just education research broadly is that belonging matters, and that, you know, students do better, learn more, have better opportunities and achievements after graduation when we look at that, when they feel that they belong and that they're a part of the school and that they're a part of the institution and they have a stake in that. And so if we're going to take seriously as people at college, which you know, I've only been here 3 weeks, but every conversation I've had, a Goucher really seems to want to build these inclusive environments. We need to do that work and think about belonging. Because it's, you know, it's so tempting and it's so easy to look at and think about, you know, changing demographics, what enrollment numbers look like, but that's literally step one, right? We have to think about how we support these populations when they're on campus, how we actually include them in the process. And again, the populations of both our students, but also our faculty, our staff of color, and these populations writ large. And so this is a book that, you know, it isn't on a lot of these anti-racist reading lists because it doesn't necessarily couch itself in the language of anti-racism, right? But I think the arguments at the core are fundamentally anti-racist. And so, you know, if we're serious about building these systems, we've got to put this work in beyond just having these people into our campus. We have to welcome them in and make them a part of this system. And I just think that, you know, that's something that we have to hammer home and think both at the micro level of what our classrooms are like as we think about our instruction methods and our, you know, how we build inclusive practices, but also at the college and university level, how we do that through student affairs and the co-curricular, and the messages we send about who belongs and who gets a voice. So I think that this is a really, you know, a critical part of these conversations. And, you know, just on the inclusive pedagogy literature, the other thing that a lot of this literature says, right, is that inclusive classrooms don't just benefit those traditionally underrepresented or marginalized groups, right? Inclusive practices have been shown time and time again to benefit all of the students in the room. And you know, to go back and quote one of the founders of this kind of movement, Gloria Ladson-Billings, you know, that's just good teaching, and it's as simple as that. And so you know, as we think about, you know, teaching in the times of both coronavirus and COVID-19, but also the movement for Black Lives, the you know, in the context, the wake of you know, the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, this I think is important work to think about what belonging means on a college campus.
So how does this work, or does this author address the kind of balance between providing inclusive spaces without kind of forcing assimilation? Because that's traditionally been a lot of what's happened in higher ed and other spaces where, yes, we're including you and we're trying to find ways to include you better, but then a lot of times what people of color or marginalized groups tend to do is be assimilated. And I've been reading a lot recently about this idea of America being a melting pot and how that's maybe not the best method for what we should be doing, because when you're melting everyone together, then suddenly your identity is also being sacrificed a little bit. So how do we does this material work talk at all about how to find that balance to be inclusive and give people a sense of belonging without erasing their identity?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? And I think that we always have to think about that. And Tony Jack does, in my opinion, a really nice job of that, because one of the things that he talks about here, so the privileged poor, that term comes from this idea. He sets up two types of traditionally underrepresented populations, and some of this is sort of class and access based. The privileged poor and what he calls the doubly disadvantaged. And he thinks about two types of students here. One type of student that gets into, you know, the elite institution and the elite college because they had come from possibly a marginalized, poor background. They dealt with poverty, and then they made it into college on day one, right? That's what he would refer to as the sort of the doubly disadvantaged student. And then he draws a parallel between that and the privileged poor, which is a student that comes from the same sort of background, but either through government programs, through nonprofit organizations, through charter schools, somehow gets a scholarship, right, and in pre-college is able to exist in these elite spaces already, and be able to assimilate to both college life, either in a boarding school or in places that are, these sort of private academies, and then think about, the experiences of those two groups differently and what that means. And to go back to this question of assimilation and how we think about this context, there's a line at the end of this book that I marked because it really makes me think about this, as far as the idea of a lot of education policy that we look at today, particularly out of a Betsy DeVos, Department of Ed, is this type of programming that produces these privileged poor, where we funnel students out of public education and give them this experience either in whatever other conception, and then put them into a university. And Jack writes here, funneling poor youth into private schools is not social policy. It's an abdication of responsibility. And that, that's the part of this that I come back to as we think about not just within colleges and universities, but we think in the broader scope of education policy in this country. It's an abdication to think that the solution to our public schooling problem in certain communities in this country is to move students out of it, because there will always be students that are still in those systems. And to go back to the original question, like, as we move out of them, we're moving them into assimilationist spaces, right? And so I think that as part of this, we have to think about how we create these culturally sustaining and culturally relevant spaces in the institutions that we have. Spoilers, I know you're going to ask me what am I going to read next? And one of the things there is I've been doing a lot of reading and thinking around what culturally sustaining classrooms are. These are classrooms that are not just reproducing white hegemonic languages and viewpoints, but are taking the experiences of these students and their cultural backgrounds and heritage backgrounds, and transforming this into an asset-based pedagogy. Right? This is not a deficit pedagogy where there are things to be overcome, but they're asset-based in we think about multiple ways of knowing and ways that we can actually bring these as tools and resources for these students. Right. And again, from an inclusive perspective, right? That diversity of viewpoints, that diversity of experiences is capable of strengthening the experiences of all students in that classroom. So I think that's, we have to be thinking about that question of assimilationist policies versus liberatory policies.
Great. So it sounds like this material would be better suited for educators or faculty. Is that, would you recommend that this is for that kind of population, or who is the ideal person in our community who would want to read this book?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's here for faculty, it's here for administrators, it's here for people in positions like me. But I also think that Tony Jack does just an incredible job of centering students' voices in this. This is a sort of large-scale interview-based ethnographic study where he's on this university and builds rapport and knows these collection of students and spends a lot of time, and he does a beautiful job of really privileging their voices and the stories that they tell. And so I would also think that also for our students of ed, but also for our students that are questioning their belonging or interested in thinking about looking across from them and reaching out to other students that they may be in class with, or other students when they think about, how to make this college, this institution, and colleges writ large, a more inclusive place, a place where everyone has a stake and belongs. the stories that these students tell, I think are powerful, and it's, it's a good book, and it's a quick read. So I'm gonna make the argument, anyone can gain from this book that sets foot on a college campus.
That's great. I'm actually taking a class on multicultural education right now, and this is not on our reading list, and I think it should be, and I'm going to advocate for that. So thank you for bringing this to
I happy to, and just it's very new. It just came out last year, so I want to make sure that we don't fault the professor for just
No. It's interesting that I'm taking this class right now. My first day of classes was June 1st for the summer term, and we had a synchronous session, and we were discussing the readings for the course, and everybody was kind of like, maybe this is a good time to rethink the reading list and rethink what kinds of activities we're doing in the material and authors we're engaging with. So I think everybody kind of agrees that this is we need a fresh look. So I'm excited about this book, and even if it doesn't end up on my reading list, I'm definitely going to read it too, because this is something that we have available at the Goucher College Library. So it's
great.
It's accessible to anybody who wants it right now.
Great, wonderful.
And I think there was one other piece that you recommended that I also haven't seen on any other reading list.
If we've got time for one more.
Yeah, if you have time, I have time.
Sure.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that third piece. It was, I just have the first part of the title. Go ahead in the rain. Yep.
The cover is misleading. The title of the book is Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes to a Tribe Called Quest by Hanif Aburraqib. But we have a lot of other stuff on the cover again, as an allusion to some other covers. This is another one that isn't written in the language of anti-racism. And so, it doesn't necessarily get a lot of press on these sort of lists, but I think at its core, when we think about Black experience and belonging, there are certainly anti-racist components at this. This is another one, as I look at the types of books that have been on these lists. Ostensibly, Aburraqib is a poet, although this is not poetry, but he's also a music critic and a cultural critic. And at its core, this is a work of music criticism. It's sort of a career retrospective of a Tribe Called Quest. The East Coast '90s hip hop group that really defined 90s hip hop and the sort of native tongues movement with people like De La Soul. But this is also, the way Aburraqib writes this is a really interesting memoir, both about his interactions with a Tribe Called Quest over his life and his experience as a Black man, as a Black boy growing up, a self-described sort of nerdy and weird kid growing up that spent, felt as comfortable in the spaces around 90s hip hop and a Tribe Called Quest as he did in sort of the 2000s pop punk and emo movements. He's got a whole other book, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, that's about his love of Fall Out Boy, and some other sort of band that you wouldn't put aside a Tribe Called Quest. But it also is about his experience, in inhabiting this Black body in these predominantly white spaces and music scene, sort of this, but also this emo pop punk sort of scene of the early 2000s. And one of the reasons that I think this book is, can be read as anti-racist and be particularly useful are for a couple reasons, and one of those is the way that Aburraqib makes connections between the period of the early 90s when Tribe Called Quest was coming out and the events at the time, particularly the assault on Rodney King by the LAPD, which shortly after that, probably Tribe Called Quest's most well-known album, The Loan Theory, comes out, and we can talk about that, and he puts that side by side with thinking about the release of their final album, a few days after Donald Trump's election, but also in a world where we had just experienced the murders of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, and puts those side by side in this longer history of white supremacist violence against the Black men and women in Black communities. So there's one moment in here, I can just read a paragraph out of this, where he's talking about Rodney King. And so he writes, it must be an odd life to be introduced to the world first through your flaws and then through your blood on the ground, or your swollen face in a mugshot, or your bent body in a wheelchair. It said that King patted the back of his pants when exiting the vehicle, which made police believe he had had a weapon. I've been thinking a lot about invisible weapons and how they relate to the body itself. I have nothing on me, but in the wrong neighborhood, I have everything on me. And it's as simple as a move for a pocket, or a low whistle in the wrong direction, or the song spilling out of my rolled down car windows. And in moments like that, I think just Aburraqib does this incredible thing in the writing where we can draw this through line from Philando Castile and Alton Sterling back through Rodney King, back through Emmett Till, back through, long histories of violence against populations in this country. And I think it's also important to think about the connection and the role that music has played in the struggle for civil rights. We can think about the role that blues and jazz play in the struggle for civil rights. We can think about 90s hip hop and people like NWA and Public Enemy and A Tribe Called Quest. And we can think about the people that are to this current moment seeing the release of Run the Jewels 4 as a soundtrack to this, let alone people like Janelle Monáe and Dirty Computer a couple of years ago, Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, right? Like with a struggle for liberation and freedom, there's always been a soundtrack and lyrics that work the same way lyricism and poetry works, that work the same way through all of these things. And this is just not only an incredibly moving book when we think about the personalized experiences of Aburraqib and his relationship to this music. It's also just technically one of the most interesting sort of critical memoirs I've ever seen by writing this piece of music criticism that's also this memoir.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never looked at it through that lens before, so it's kind of cool that there is a book that's looking at it from that personal perspective, but also connecting it to those historical events as well. So how did you, as a political scientist and someone who works with faculty teaching development, how did you discover this work?
So I'm a Tribe Called Quest fan. I like that, and I had, I've played music all my life, and music is important in who I am and what I do, and so this was something that had been on my radar for a while. I mean, I don't mean to pretend that this is not a well-known book. This was shortlisted for the National Book Award, but I don't think it gets talked about in this sort of anti-racist circles. And so I think that there's a way that you can read this book and think about this in these contexts. But yeah, Aburraqib is also it's a great follow on Twitter. And I think probably one of the best cultural critics writing right now. So I'll read anything by him. They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us is another excellent book that has probably one of the best covers I've ever seen. But yes, so I'll also preach the Hanif Aburraqib gospel as much as I will the Morgan Parker one.
Okay, great. So I think you made a really good case, obviously, for this being something that people who are looking to learn more about the perspective of people of color and learning more about how music can intersect with that. But do you think there's any particular population from in the Goucher community who would really find this interesting, and if somebody was going to go pick a book right now, what would make it this book for them?
What would make it that book? Yeah, I mean, I think this book is useful both for somebody that would come to the work through hip hop pedagogy and has a love of hip hop to begin with, but it's also quite useful for someone that never quite got it, right, or doesn't exist in that space, but wants to understand what this moment, what this music, what this movement can mean. Because in the way Aburraqib writes here, this is from a place of love and a place of passion about this, and that is palpable. And so as you think through, there's all types of things written. There's amazing stuff written on Marvin Gaye and what's going on and as a soundtrack for a time. And sometimes we don't give the same sort of critical analysis to more contemporary works. I know there's boatloads of things written about Kendrick Lamar and Pimp a Butterfly, but this is just another good example of how we can think through music at a time, particularly the early 90s, when mainstream culture wasn't necessarily giving hip-hop culture the same sort of critical lens and respect that now I think it's getting.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing
yeah.
that. I think this is a really diverse group of materials that you've shared with us today, so I'm really excited about
something
that
for everybody,
because it's something that hasn't shown up on the lists that are going around. So I think this is a great way to introduce our community to some other things. And you hinted at this a little bit a few minutes ago, but what are you going to read or watch next related to anti-racism and your work in this context?
So I pulled a couple things off my to-be-read shelf. I think it's important that we spend time with the classics and revisit them every once in a while. And so an author whose work I haven't really revisited since my own college experience is Frantz Fanon. And so on my reading list is Black Skin, White Masks, which is, he's essentially known for this book and his other book, The Wretched of the Earth, but does a lot. So he's originally from Martinique and spent time in Algeria as a psychologist or a psychiatrist and sort of an anthropologist, and spent a lot of time thinking about racism and colonialism and how those went together and the impact of colonialism's legacy on racist structures and institutions, and wrote a lot of fundamental things about Black identity, Black liberation, but also about giving form to and naming whiteness, which is necessary if we are to decenter whiteness, right? And so that's one thing. I'm gonna go back and refresh on him. I've also got on my list The Fire This Time, which is an edited volume by Jesmyn Ward. This is sort of a contemporary commentary and update. The subtitle is A New Generation Speaks About Race. A lot of lists are recommending, rightfully so, James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And, this can be read in sort of conjunction as a contemporary, commentary on the same things Baldwin is writing about. And then the third thing, just because of, I run a teaching center. So here's what Geneva Gay's culturally responsive teaching, theory, research, and practice. This is pretty in the weeds for educators. So, but those are the things that are on my reading list when I'm going to think about how we can incorporate these things into some classes at Goucher and into our practices and our praxis.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And I don't think you sent me a list of those things that you're going to read next. So if you could,
I'll send you the citations.
Send me those. We'll check into seeing whether or not we have them in the library, and if not, we'll look into getting them. I'm pretty sure we have the culture of responsive teaching. I might actually have that in one of my big stacks of books that are sitting around my office right now.
Perfect.
So thank you for sharing, and thank you for joining me today on Instagram Live. Is there anything else that you didn't get to say, or that's come up in our conversation that you want to share before we sign off today?
I will just say, because I'm still new to this campus, and for anybody around campus that sees this and is looking for thought partners and is looking for people to work through on this, reach out. In these socially distant times. And I look forward to seeing you all when we get back on campus this fall. But there's going to be a lot of work and a lot of programming coming out of CAST, out of the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship and Teaching, that's going to wrestle with some of these ideas of what it actually means for inclusive practices, what it means to be teaching in the era of COVID-19 and in the era of the movement for Black Lives. And so I think this is really important work that we have to do as a community, as a college, as educators. And I look forward to doing it with you. So
yeah, me too. So I'm glad you're here. Have you actually been on campus yet?
I've been on campus twice. Once for the interview and once to pick up this laptop. Yeah. I look forward to spending some more time there.
Yeah, I know we're all looking forward to it. So thank you again for being willing to share your materials and your perspective and discuss this and help our Goucher College community. And to everyone who's joining us, you can check out our anti-oppression guide on the library website. You can find a link to that in our bio, and we'll be sending out updates about that soon. And please join us for our next couple sessions. We have another Instagram Live scheduled, and then we're going to push out a recording of a couple other faculty who are discussing their work. So thank you for everyone who's here today and for engaging with us, and we're excited to continue these conversations and continuing to learn together. So I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you again, Dr. Harder, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Bye.
Bye.